afternoon and a very warm welcome to this EPC update and post-summit briefing. It's part of our regular look at the key developments in and around the EU in the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the European Policy Centre, and with me, as always, this week are Janis Emmanouilidis, the EPC's Director of Studies, and Chief Executive Fabian Zuleeg, and our special guest this week, delighted to welcome for the first half of our discussion, EPC Senior Policy Analyst Amanda Paul. Great to have you with us, Amanda. Thank you for joining us. As always, totally interactive session with questions from me, and then I hope from all of you in this hour, which we are going to devote entirely to discussing the summit, the special summit that took place yesterday and today and has only just ended. So we're bringing you quick, sharp analysis right off the back of those press conferences, which finished just a little while ago. Housekeeping note for those joining us for the first time, or for those who are using so many platforms they can't remember which button to press anymore, your microphones are muted. If you want to ask a question orally, just press the handshake button and I will unmute you when the time comes and I'll tell you I've done it. Or you can write your question, just click on the enter a question button, write it and hit enter. And could I plead again, you usually ignore me, but I'm going to plead again anyway, for short questions so I can see really quickly and at a glance what your question is and who it's for. Twitter length or less would be magnificent. So let's get underway. And before we get into the detail, and we're going to focus in the first half of our discussion on the external relations issues that were addressed, and in the second half on more domestic and economic related issues. But I wanted to ask you all a first question. In his invitation letter, Charles Michel said the focus at the summit would be on, and I quote, Europe's place in the world and our capacity to shape our own destiny. Very grand sounding, but what did he actually mean when he was talking about shaping our own destiny? Amanda, what do you think he meant?
I mean, personally, to be honest, I don't really have a clue what he meant. Perhaps he was trying to motivate himself ready for the summit to get, decisive results from his colleagues that would show that the EU is really quick at making decisions. Or alternatively, he could have been following on from his Bruegel speech 4 days ago or 3 days ago, which was on the need for the EU to have an effective strategic autonomy, to be a stronger actor in the world. So I think he was probably following through on that vibe, to keep it going, to inspire his colleagues, to get a good summit underway with decisive results.
And was it a good summit with decisive results for you?
Well, it got results, but it wasn't very quick. And some of the things could probably have been dealt with extremely quicker, including, of course, on Turkey,
which we'll come back to in a very little while. Fabian, for you, shape our own destiny. What was he referring to there? Much of the summit did focus on external relations, but seeing it would seem the external and the domestic as two sides of the same coin. Is that what he was pointing to?
I think certainly that was part of the thinking, that what is happening globally is having a big impact on what we need to do internally. The single market, the industrial policy has a very strong external dimension, and that was reflected. But I also think he was referring to some of the rather unedifying debates we've had within Europe, where we have not been able to come to conclusions, even having different issues being dragged into the debate. So I think this was also a little reminder to the leaders to say we should be decisive when it comes to external policy. And if we don't speak with a single voice, we will be ineffective.
And for you, your overall assessment of the summit, this was an extraordinary summit, a special one. It was supposed to be last week, delayed for a week because Charles Michel had to self-isolate. We have another one in 2 weeks' time. Did we need it? Did it achieve anything?
In some way we needed it because, if you like, there was some housekeeping. There were a lot of issues which had to be discussed at summit level, which there was simply no time when we were discussing recovery plan and MFF. We've also had a number of developments. Clearly, we'll come back to Turkey, but that was one of the more pressing issues. Belarus, of course, the crisis there. So in that sense, yes, there was a need to have the summit. Was it very decisive? Looking at the conclusions, I don't see a particularly convincing set of actions coming out of that. But on the other hand, we couldn't have waited till the next summit, because most likely that will be completely taken up by Brexit. So we have to get these things out of the way.
Thank you, and we'll come back on some of that detail, as you say, in a little while, and including we will talk at the end, I hope, briefly about Brexit. But Janis, for you, your overall assessment and your interpretation of this objective that Charles Michel set himself, both before the summit and indeed in talking about the future summits. He talks in quite lofty terms about what summits are for and so on. What's your assessment of what came out of it?
Well, first of all, I think that there are three main reasons why he said that we need the summit in order to discuss Europe's place in the world. One is, over the past 7 months, we were very much, and the European Council was very much focusing on COVID-19, on the crisis, on issues more immediately related to COVID-19, which we all know relates to a lot of issues, including the external, but it was related to COVID-19. So there was the need to have a bigger discussion on issues of issues related to external relations. Second, he personally believes that strategic autonomy / resilience is something which is important. If you talk to him in person, in smaller circles, you will see that this is something which he really cares about. This is something which is close to him. He believes that Europe needs to foster its role at the international, global level. So he believes in it. And third, let's not forget foreign policy, as it is being conducted at the highest political level in the European Union, is something which is very much in the domain of the European Council. It is EU leaders which need to take decisive decisions when it comes to, for example, issues like the relationship between EU and Turkey, which means that the European Council is the place to do so, and he's president of the European Council. So that's another reason why I think he wants to promote issues related to Europe's global role.
Okay, let's come to Turkey. You've all mentioned it in answering that first question. The dinner discussion, something like 6-7 hours, devoted entirely to discussing the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean and relations with Turkey. Amanda, what is your assessment of the outcome of the summit and where you think we are now? I was quite struck by a tweet that I read from someone this morning saying, geopolitical commission, ? Quotes arguing about exactly how vaguely to allude to the threat of possible sanctions against Turkey that may or may not be imposed at some indeterminate point in the future. If that was all we got out, and I don't know whether you agree that's all we got out of it, why did it take so long?
Well, I think that discussions around Turkey have always taken a long time. I remember some years ago, Andrew Duff, the former MEP, saying that whenever there was a session in the parliament, you should take your sandwiches if Turkey was on the agenda, because it would literally last for hours. And that hasn't changed today. But I mean, I think, the result that happened yesterday night was positive. It showed that, diplomacy and engagement won out, at least for the moment. I think that's a good result. But at the same time, I would also say that the can has been kicked down the road vis-a-vis possible punitive measures in the future if Turkey's actions in the Eastern Mediterranean don't change. So it's still possible, or very possible, we may be back on this topic in a very short period of time.
And were they at all specific? I mean, Charles Michel said we will use all the instruments at our disposal. Ursula von der Leyen talking about the toolbox is ready, but there was nothing specific about what they might do or when they might do it, was there?
There wasn't anything specific. There was references again to all the tools they have, but they didn't really say what these tools are. I'm guessing the majority of member states are hoping that these tools will never have to be used. That the dialogue that is ongoing now between Greece and Turkey will bring some fruits, both within the EU framework, but also within NATO, which is also very important. I mean, Mr. Borrell has been asked to bring together all of the countries of the region for a multilateral conference, which is important to discuss energy issues and other issues. And also there was reference in the conclusions to the decades-old Cyprus problem, and the hope that once a new leader in the north of Cyprus is elected in a few weeks' time, that will be another opportunity to bring a solution to the island, because I mean, clearly a solution to the Cyprus problem would bring regional stability and security, and all of these issues would be removed from the table.
And can I ask, you said it was positive that diplomacy and engagement won out. Do you believe, given your expertise in this area and what we've seen happen over recent months and years, is there a chance that talks with Turkey actually could get us to some sort of sustainable outcome, something that really genuinely reduces these tensions and gets us back onto a positive footing that Ursula von der Leyen said she'd like to get back to?
I mean, I think everything's possible, but I mean, really, the ball is in Turkey's court. President Erdogan, among his many, negative statements, has also said that he supports dialogue and engagement over this issue. And of course, there's a number of positive things that can come out of this for Turkey, because again, this positive agenda was put on the table, and this includes things like upgrading the customs union, which is something that Turkey really wants. Upgrading as well, if you can call it that, the EU-Turkey migrant deal, which would be positive, putting more money on the table regarding the migration issue. But I mean, why wouldn't Turkey get that money anyway, frankly speaking? But these sorts of things, to have a renewed sort of positive dialogue on many issues between the EU and Turkey, which have been stalled, because most of the high-level dialogue, or all of it, doesn't go on anymore between Turkey and the EU. There's very little opportunity for dialogue or conversation on any issue. It's all been closed off.
Janis, your assessment, would you share Amanda's conclusion that broadly this was a good outcome because it keeps that engagement on the table? Or would you share the question marks of those who say, why on earth did it take 7 hours to come to such a vague conclusion, and that really wasn't enough and doesn't demonstrate the EU being a geopolitical commission, a geopolitical EU?
Well, first of all, what we witnessed as an outcome is a typical European compromise. We have different positions among the EU27, how to deal with the current situation, how to deal with the relationship with Turkey. There are the hawks, which includes the Greeks and the Cypriots, but also the Austrians and the French, who want a tough line on Turkey. And there are doves, which are led especially by Germany and by Angela Merkel, who says that this is a strategic relationship and we need to be careful that we don't derail from a good relationship, which we've had in the past and should be having also in future. Having said that, I think that first of all, we need to remind ourselves that the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean is really dangerous. We've seen an increasing escalation of the situation over the summer. There was a risk of a negative escalating spiral, that things might run out of control, also maybe through an accident. So we're talking about 2 EU member states, 2 NATO member states. And if things would run out of control, this would have an immense negative fallout for the countries concerned in the regions, but also wider implications. Amanda already mentioned the migration issue, which is one of the issues, but it's not only migration. If you look into the wider regions, Turkey is a central point and a central actor on many, many conflicts. So I think it's good that we now have this compromise among the EU27. It is following a dual strategy. It is sticks and carrots. There's no indication, there's indication that sanctions might be put on Turkey, but it's not mentioned explicitly. However, there are references to articles in the treaties which are related to sanctions, so everybody knows what we're talking about. And then there's the carrots to launch a positive EU-Turkey agenda, as Amanda has said. So the question now is whether one actually thinks that what has come up as an EU position will help to make sure that we will get to what I would call a sustainable de-escalation. I don't see that we will get to a settlement with respect to the many complex issues we're talking about, which are historically strongly burdened.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll give Amanda a chance to react to that in a moment. But Fabian, for you, the right mix of sticks and carrots?
I think it's a very difficult situation. So we are not going to know whether it's the right mix of sticks and carrots because it's not going to be resolved at this moment in time. I think what is also necessary is to keep in mind what a possible escalation would look like, what might have to be done if the situation doesn't improve. So in that sense, I think it was a necessary step to have this discussion. There is now a common position on the table, but we will have to see how the situation develops, whether there is a de-escalation or whether things continue to deteriorate in the next few weeks, and then it might well be back on the agenda of the summit in 2 weeks' time if we haven't seen any progress.
And Amanda, for you, this sustainable de-escalation, do you believe that that is now, that we have the basis to achieve that? You said the ball's in Turkey's court. What do you think Turkey will do? Will they see the allusion to, if you continue with, I think Ursula von der Leyen called it the provocations and the pressure, we have the tools and we're ready. How do you expect them to react? Do you think there is a way to use this now to get that de-escalation?
I mean, today Turkey can be quite an unpredictable actor. I mean, there's a strong sense, not just from the ruling party in Turkey, but across all of the parties in Turkey, with the exception, I think, of the HDP, the Kurdish party, that Turkey's policy in the Eastern Mediterranean is the right policy. So this is not just a one-party issue. So there hasn't been, as far as I know, any explicit response yet from Ankara to this agreement. I mean, Turkey can act one way one day and then decide to do something else the next. But I think the fact that you now have these, these ongoing technical discussions under the NATO umbrella to avoid any sort of accident or escalation is something that's very positive. But again, as already been mentioned, things can escalate again really quickly. And obviously, the main component of this is down to the actual energy resources in the Eastern Mediterranean that will continue to be, I would say, contentious unless, as I mentioned, there's a resolution to the Cyprus problem. So I would just like to highlight this point, which was actually recently written about in an EPC publication regarding, this East Med pipeline, which actually contradicts the Green Deal and the Paris Agreement, and that the EU should actually be working to try and encourage, Turkey, Cyprus, and other actors in that region towards more sustainable energy and not financing this sort of project. I think this would be something that would be also a positive step, because it could help prevent these sort of further escalations in the future.
Okay, quick point, Janis, you want to come in, then I want to move on to Belarus.
I think that what Amanda was referring to when she was talking about the national situation in Turkey is also important with respect to the other two main actors. If you look into Greece and Cyprus, and if you see how the reactions have been to the outcome of the summit already in Greece and Cyprus, you see that the opposition parties are critical of the outcome, because they say that we didn't achieve enough, the government didn't achieve enough. And that shows you that in these countries, you also have a we cannot give up again this time attitude. And I think this is dangerous. So if you have on all sides parties, actors who are following a very tough line, there is a danger that we might not only come back to the issue and discuss it at the European level, but that things might get out of control. And let's not forget a factor which is very strong is the absence of the US in the current situation compared to in the past. The Trump administration is forced to at some point react, but actually it's not proactively doing its utmost. So you have a situation which I think can not only lead to this kind of a sustainable de-escalation. We're not talking about resolving the main issues which are on the table.
Thank you. And Amanda, can I come back to you? We need to move on a little bit, but I wanted to just pick up on that point Janis made about in Greece and in Cyprus saying we didn't achieve enough, and link that to Belarus. because I'm wondering for you, the Cyprus strategy, which linked this issue to Belarus and blocked an agreement on sanctions, they've now lifted that block. There was agreement. I mean, it showed the depth of feeling about this issue in Cyprus that they were willing to hold up the EU, sending a strong signal to Belarus. How do you read that? How do you read the way Cyprus played this and what it means for the future? And do you think it had an impact on the EU's ability to put pressure on Lukashenko, that it was so easily derailed for a while by an unrelated issue?
I mean, first of all, I think it was an incredibly self-centered act that wasted a lot of time and undermined the EU's credibility. And as you mentioned, the decision could have been taken weeks and weeks ago. I mean, we have to remember as well what actually happened in Belarus. You know, you had the fraudulent elections, which were followed by a significant crackdown on innocent protesters. There's been massive human rights violations. There's even been deaths. This continues today. A number of people are missing, including, you know, opposition leaders. I mean, it was a very, very serious situation. And I think the fact that the EU wasn't able to respond immediately sent a very long signal. So thanks to God, that's over with. That's over with now, and we've moved to the next stage. But I mean, if you're asking, do I think this decision is going to have any impact on Lukashenko? No, I don't. I don't think it will change his calculus or his policies, and he will continue down this road. And the reaction of the EU to that should be to put sanctions on Lukashenko, as they did once in the past. There's no reason why sanctions shouldn't be there again.
Because there's a question from the audience, actually, from Andres Peterson, saying he's missing from the sanctions list. Indeed, we know that. Why? Why did they decide not to include him?
I think it's because they have decided that by not including him at this point, it could encourage a dialogue between Lukashenko and the opposition parties for a sort of transition of power. But I don't think that really figures into his, you know, calculus. So I don't think that would be very effective. I guess that President Lukashenko will continue to look to the Russians to find another way out of this. But I mean, honestly, I think his days are numbered, and he should step down and leave.
Thank you very much. I want to move to try and draw some conclusions. What does this mean for EU foreign policy, both in relation to the Turkey question and to Belarus? And we've talked there about one member state in particular, but last night, you know, you talked about the hawks and the doves in this situation. But for you, each of you, and Fabian, perhaps to come to you first on this, does it for you strengthen the argument for qualified majority voting in foreign policy? We can't allow, for example, sanctions against Belarus to be held up for weeks, as Amanda was saying, and not be able to put pressure. Or conversely, does it tell you that in the EU, when feelings are running so high that a small country like Cyprus is willing to hold up the EU doing something which was universally felt to be important, that actually that's a signal you can't have QMV, and if you tried to do it, it just wouldn't work? How do you read this in terms of the lesson we draw if we really want to be a more geopolitical union?
I think there's a very easy answer in the sense of course, to be a more effective geopolitical actor, we would need a single line. But how do you get there? And that has always been the problem with this. Is it chicken or egg? If you were to introduce a new way of voting, would that remove the differences which are there between member states? Yes, it wouldn't give countries like Cyprus the ability to hijack the system. But in the end, the reason why we continue to not have QMV is because there are significant differences between member states, and outvoting them on issues which they deeply care about, I think is neither feasible, especially if we think this through to the end. What happens if one of the major big countries is being outvoted? But also, I think it's unrealistic to expect that the member states will agree to it. They are not going to give up this power anytime soon.
Thank you. Janis, your assessment?
Well, I think I'm a very strong realist here. On the one hand, yes, we should have the possibility to have more QMV, more qualified majority voting when it comes to foreign policy issues, but we will not get there. Because this is exactly something which member states will not surrender. Because look at the current issue with respect to EU-Turkey relationship. This is at the core of national interest for the countries, the EU countries concerned, not only for Turkey, so not only for Cyprus, sorry, and Greece, but it's also something which is important to a good number of other member states. And on other occasions, when it comes to sanctions, you have others whose national interests are strongly affected or potentially affected. So member states will not give up their ability to veto the imposition of sanctions. Now, with respect to the concrete issue in Cyprus, I think we need to be a bit careful. Yes, I agree with Amanda. This was the link between Turkey, Belarus was not good. It led to a time delay which was not at all positive, and it also undermined the ability of the EU to play a role in the situation in Belarus. But it's not the first time. So we've seen that also other member states have done similar things in the past. And I think that everyone should be reminded, and when it comes, for example, to sanctions, that everyone has bared some responsibility in the past or on other issues related to QMV in the domain of foreign policy.
Amanda, your assessment of that, and if I could link just by way of a sort of a closing thought on this, Charles Michel, in what he calls his leader's agenda for 2020-2021, says that Europe's role in the world will be on the agenda of every European Council meeting. Well, as Janis said earlier, foreign policy has always been a matter for the EU leaders. It is virtually always on the agenda in some form or another, because there's an issue to discuss, and we didn't get round to China. Maybe we'll come back to that later on if we have time, linking it to the domestic debate. But for you, does this strengthen the argument for QMV? Does it lessen it? And do you draw any significance from this pronouncement that Europe's role in the world will always be discussed?
I think that Europe's role in the world will always be discussed and continue to be on the agendas of every summit, as he said. I mean, on the issue of QMV, I mean, I more or less agree with what both Fabian and Janis has said, because I think it's a case of that we want our cake, but we want to eat it as well, and you can't have it both ways. I mean, depending on the issue, there's always this discussion about QMV, but actually it depends on the issues at stake. So I would imagine that trying to get unanimity on changing to QMV is always going to be impossible, despite the fact that whichever member state, for whichever reason, from time to time will say, oh yes, we should have it on QMV, which is the case at the moment, but it would be almost impossible to obtain.
And on that note, may Janis, Fabian and I join in thanking you, Amanda, for joining us, and thank you with your many, many years of experience and expertise on Turkey. It was very helpful to have that analysis of where we are, because frankly, I think for most of us, 7 hours of arguing, which appeared to produce very little, seemed strange. It's now a lot clearer why it happened and where we got to. But as you said, de-escalation maybe slightly, but the danger is still there. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you have to leave us now. So on behalf of the audience, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Jacki. Thanks, guys.
Goodbye. So, Janis and Fabian, let us turn now to matters domestic, so to speak, economic matters. Ursula von der Leyen, and I'm linking back to that shaping to your own destiny, said in a tweet this morning, yesterday the European Council focused on external action, but to remain relevant in today's international environment, the EU needs a strong inner core. Before we talk about the summit outcome, Fabian, I wanted to turn to you first, because you published a commentary yesterday, and you are asking whether an internal and external level playing field are still feasible. You had a rather provocative title to your commentary, The End of the Level Playing Field, with a question mark. What do you mean by feasible? And what was your answer to that? Because I want to set our discussions on the summit in the context of how you see this debate about level playing fields.
I think we have to recognize that the crisis we're going through at the moment is having profound structural impacts. This is not simply a downturn where at some point in time we will return to the status quo before the crisis, but actually it's changing how our societies work, and in particular how our economies work. And what we are seeing, that both internally and externally, where we've always had this goal, this desire of having a level playing field, that level playing field is being undermined. It's undermined for good and for bad reasons. It's undermined because countries are becoming more protectionist. Countries are trying to also use the external economic dimension globally as a way of exerting power, of getting very narrow interests. But also there are good reasons why the level playing field is being skewed, be it to help companies which are getting in trouble now, or to get the digital and the sustainability transformation going. But the reality is, in my view, this is not going to stop. We are going to have these challenges permanently. So when I read some of the conclusions in the summit, which say we'll return to the pre-COVID state, I don't think that is possible because of the actions we're taking now. So we have to, in my view, look at the level playing field, both internally and externally, and adjust our policies to this new reality. And that means also taking some difficult decisions in areas like competition policy.
You talked about going beyond the concept of the single market to create a single European territory. What do you mean by that?
I think it's best to illustrate that with an example of what we're seeing at the moment. At this point in time, we have one member state which is outspending everyone else on state aids. And that, in the long term, is an unsustainable situation because it does create not only a support framework for German firms, it also does create a competitive disadvantage for other companies which are based in countries which don't receive this kind of support. So I think what we are seeing at the moment is a situation where the only way we can address this consistently is if we take some of these policies and do them jointly at the European level. And that's what I mean by a single economic territory. It means that essentially some of the competences which at the moment reside at the national level will have to be taken to the European level to eliminate these imbalances of the level playing field.
Okay, so having set that context, you described one more question, Fabian, then I'll bring you in, Janis, I promise. But you described the conclusions of this summit as not convincing. So my question to you is, in the context of what you believe we need to do, as you've just outlined, what is your assessment of the discussions that they had on single market, on industrial policy, competition policy? Why did you find it so unconvincing?
Well, it's all very worthy. We have reiterated many of the things which we have been saying for years, for a long time since pre-COVID. It's interesting, and I always find it a little bit amusing when you read some of the conclusions, which essentially are the member states admonishing themselves to implement the kind of things they have agreed beforehand. But in actually the recognition of these changes I've just been talking about, and in the willingness to then put new solutions on the table, to think a bit bigger, there wasn't much in this particular summit. And I think we can see that also when it comes to the single market bit. I've just mentioned the problem of state aids, and the crucial sentence within the conclusion is the European Council underlined the need to return to the normal functioning of the single market as soon as possible. That doesn't mean very much, and I think that's also, what is the normal functioning of the single market in a post-COVID world? That question hasn't been answered.
And it is quite striking because Ursula von der Leyen herself said in the press conference that ended a little while ago, she said, we've been talking about completing the single market for years and we need to make progress. And then she talked about various things they were doing already, but there wasn't, Janis, I mean, for you, was there any substance that you would point to in relation to all these issues, the industrial policy, single market, competition policy? Was there anything that you thought, okay, yes, that's a step forward, that's not just words, we are moving in a direction here?
Well, first of all, words matter. So if you can identify what you consider to be the problem, the challenge, and what you basically want to achieve in terms of your bigger objectives, already this is something which is positive. But I want to come back to something which Fabian said, which I think this is at the heart of the matter. We are still not fully aware of what this crisis and the consequences of this crisis will mean for the single market, for the external level playing field, for global competition, and so forth. And we see that also if you look into the council conclusions, and if you listen to the press conference you were referring to, that the actors, that goes for European institutions, but it also goes for member states, are saying we will come back to that. We have to revise our industrial strategy in light of what has happened since the Commission proposed it in March. We need to rethink the competition rules. This is not a new discussion. So we see a lot of the things which already had been thought about. There's a need to rethink and to rethink it in another context. And here, the outcome of the conclusions of the summit and the conclusions of the summit are rather vague, and we always see that we will refer back to them. So there will be another discussion on all these issues related to the economy in March of 2021. So that's good, because at least we know that we need to have more of a debate, more of discussions, but will they actually deliver? Still many question marks related to that.
Maybe, sorry, just to add one thing. I mean, I think one of the key things I look for to determine whether this is serious or not is what are the trade-offs, what are the prioritizations, and what we are getting essentially is we can do everything. We can achieve more of everything and everything will work. But the reality is, especially in the context of a crisis, we have to make hard choices. And there will be some issues which will be more important. If we, for example, say that strategic autonomy is one of the key things which we want to achieve, then what are we willing to sacrifice to achieve that? Does it mean, for example, that we accept that international free trade is more limited because countries are pursuing strategic autonomy? But what we do in these conclusions, and what we generally do, is we say we want strategic autonomy, but we want that to be open. So we will have our cake and eat it. We will have everything.
Exactly. I mean, I'm frankly, I'm still not sure I understand what strategic autonomy means, because every time you ask that question, you never get a straight answer.
No, but there's also, referring to this, let's be clear about this. There are very different ideas of what strategic autonomy means and what resilience means and what digital sovereignty means, and different member states and different EU leaders think very differently when they use the same words, and it's no coincidence that now a group of 19 countries who call themselves the Friends of the Single Market, led by the Finns, have put themselves together in order to fight those who they perceive mean, if they talk about strategic autonomy, more European protectionism. So you have severe differences between the EU member states when it comes to something which, in general, everybody says, yes, we need to be more autonomous. Yes, the crisis has shown that we need to be more autonomous in the digital field, but also when it comes to how we conduct our industrial policies. But when it comes to the details, the differences are major between member states.
And it's striking, there are no questions coming from the audience. So just to follow up one point on here, Fabian, I was quite struck because you have talked a lot in these update sessions about this question of state aids internally. And yet, and the whole imbalances, and you talk about this a lot in the commentary, and yet the only reference I heard, certainly from Ursula von der Leyen in the press conference, was to legislation on foreign subsidies. So picking up on one very small part of it, and the elephant in the room, what do we do about the degree to which we have allowed one country in particular to massively support its industry? Unmentionable. So, I mean, I don't know whether to you that says 'twas ever thus at summits, and it doesn't mean it isn't an issue they will address. It's just the nature of EU summits, or it's really a sign that the EU is still remaining its level of generality and won't really concretize what it's doing. And I am wondering, I mean, Charles Michel has said in his leader's agenda, the president intends to bring the various dimensions of the green transition and digital transformation onto the agenda early next year. Some specific things, digital tax. Do they need to put more specific things on the agenda to get more specific and concrete conversations, or would that be counterproductive? Fabian?
Yeah, I think you can even put a more negative interpretation on this. Maybe what we have agreed with the recovery and the MFF is a way of keeping some countries quiet. And essentially, it is here are some transfers, but in return, we will leave it up to countries themselves to spend and do whatever they want within their domestic economy, even though we know this has repercussions for the single market and for other countries. I don't know whether that is what is behind it, but I think whether it's intended or not, that is the reality, because, and this is where the one reference which you have in the conclusions on the internal dimension is this idea that we will return to the orderly functioning of the single market. But that's not possible, because once you have actually done this, you create, of course, a fait accompli. If certain companies survive and others don't, because of state aid, then it doesn't matter whether you reintroduce the rules at a later stage. If you give companies a permanent competitive advantage, and we also have to take into account that countries are now getting deeply involved in their companies. Are we really expecting that in a year's time, if some of these problems persist, the Commission will go to the German government and say, okay, now is the day when you're going to have to stop supplying state aids to Lufthansa or to whatever other company, and then Lufthansa might go bankrupt. Is that really politically feasible?
A question and a comment really more from Malcolm Harbour. Surely the single market is a crucial tool to deliver on that strategic autonomy we've been talking about. But Janis, Fabian mentioned there the multi-annual financial framework. And there was not much discussion, I don't think. I think there might have been a brief report back on where the negotiations with the Parliament are, and not much discussion either of the rule of law, which seems to be the biggest sticking point. Where are we? Was there any real conversation, or does that get left for the next summit?
Let me link the discussion on the MFF with what we were discussing just before. Because the elephant in the room you were mentioning, Jacki, the fact that Germany is able to support its industries, its companies in a much different way than anyone else, everyone is aware of that elephant in the room. Decision makers are aware of the elephant in the room. And without this elephant, actually, we would not have, that's my reading of things, would not have such a substantial agreement we had between Paris and Berlin in May, June, which actually led to the agreement on the MFF and Next Generation EU. So the elephant is very, very obvious, but it's also being used. And Berlin has realized that others know of the elephant and are ready to do things which they probably would have not been ready to do 3, 6, or 8 or 9 months ago. And now with respect to the MFF, there was an exchange, there was an update by Angela Merkel, given that Germany is in the Council presidency. She updated about how negotiations are, but they had no actual discussion about the negotiations, and they obviously did not also have a discussion on the most thorny issue, which is the rule of law issue. This is something which will move to October and maybe not even be concluded in October, because the differences between member states when it comes to rule of law are enormous. We know what the positions of the Hungarian government and the Polish government is. It wants a settlement which is in their interest. Other governments also want a settlement, but they want a different kind of settlement. The European Parliament has a distinctive position. And let's not forget, for some, having maybe a postponement with respect to actually implementing MFF and Next Generation EU is something which they consider not to be that much of a problem, because they from the beginning were not that much supportive of that compromise. So no actual discussion now, postponed, and I think it will not even be settled in October.
And just to point out that the EPC has an event next Tuesday on this very question of the rule of law with the European Commissioner for Justice, Didier Reynders. So do tune in for that one if you can. Fabian, I just wanted to come back on something we didn't talk about earlier, but it links into all this question of strategic autonomy and so on. China was supposed to be debated at this summit. I think got lost in the midst of the 6-7 hours arguing about the vagueness of the wording on Turkey that we discussed in the first half. Is it of concern that it wasn't discussed? Because many people would say that alongside what's happening in the US, this is the defining geopolitical challenge of our age, and yet the EU leaders have yet again not really had a substantive discussion. Does it concern you, or do you think that was inevitable with the US elections looming and the whole link between the two?
I wouldn't say they didn't have a discussion, because in some way the whole discussion on industrial policy, on strategic autonomy, is very much about China. So this is one of the core driving forces behind action at the European level. So in that sense, China was on the agenda. But yes, in terms of the actual EU-China relationship, it wasn't discussed much. I think that's also an interesting contrast if we think back to pre-COVID times. In some ways, the German presidency had one of its core pillars was the EU-China relationship. That has obviously changed quite a lot within the last month. But I think that also has another reason, and that other reason is what you refer to in terms of the other superpower, which is the United States. And we clearly have at the moment a great uncertainty. I would say from a European perspective, maybe a great hope that there will be a change at the beginning of November. And that will also change the European Union stance towards China. So in some ways, this is more a wait and see moment, because if it is a Biden presidency, it means something very different than a Trump presidency.
So Janis, we come back to that link between the external and the internal, as Fabian's saying. They didn't have the discussion about the relationship, but it was all about China. I asked Amanda earlier, and I didn't get a chance to ask you then, but in terms of this putting Europe's role in the world on the agenda for every summit, as I say, you indicated earlier, it always has been in one form or another. Do you see a difference in the way that Charles Michel is framing that now? Does it suggest a real change in the way the council works or in its focus, or for you, is it window dressing?
Well, as I said earlier, I think he personally puts a strong focus on issues related to external affairs, to strategic autonomy and so forth. But actually, I don't see that we will witness institutionally a big difference now. Saying that you will be dealing with issues of external affairs at every European Council meeting is more or less something which is a given. And if you have a reason to have a discussion like we have when things happen, like in Nagorno-Karabakh or in Belarus, you have it on the agenda anyway. So for me, there is no big difference. With respect to China, let's not forget there will be a summit in November. It's indicated also in the leaders' agenda where they will come back to the issue. And I think that the outcome of the US election, even if Trump loses, will even clearly show that with a Biden administration, the situation between China and the US will not improve. And that, I think, can mean, from a European perspective, can mean that we might, as Europeans, have a stronger leverage on China, which is also struggling because of the crisis and the economic effects of the crisis. So we might be, even after the US election, stronger than we are now. But then the U27 will have to be able to speak with one voice, and that has always been a challenge when you deal with the superpowers.
Absolutely. No questions coming from our audience at the moment. So 2 more quick ones before we wrap up. Hang on. I want to talk about the pandemic for a moment, because added to the agenda at the last moment for this morning's discussion was to talk about the response to the pandemic. There was talk afterwards about agreeing to strengthen, Charles Michel said, cooperation and coordination on the basis of European Commission proposals. But I wasn't quite clear what they had actually agreed, if anything, in substance, because I noticed Ursula von der Leyen, when she talked about it, she said 3 key things we did. Cooperating on vaccines. Well, I thought we were doing that anyway. Cooperating on who gets the vaccine. Maybe that's a bit of an advance. And then when she came to the business of colour codes and countries and what list they're on, she said, and I've put forward proposals. I didn't hear her say, and they got a rousing reception from EU leaders. Did we get anywhere? And then, Fabian, we have to turn for 2 minutes to the dreaded topic of Brexit. But Janis, on the pandemic.
Well, if you compare it to the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, actually, yes, we have made progress. If you refer to this summit, no, we haven't really made any progress. And the Council conclusions say, and I quote, we need to further step up the overall coordination effort. That shows you that we are far away from having a coordinated response, especially when it comes to some of the practical issues of how we deal with a crisis related, for example, to the color coding. For any one of us who's traveling for private or for professional reasons throughout Europe, you see what kind of chaos there is, and things are changing day by day. So we haven't even been able, 7 months after the crisis has erupted, to come up with a system which at least allows for a level of coordination which all of us will be able to understand, and which also, by the way, will help us to fight the pandemic in the reality of a single market of a European Union where people travel all around. So unfortunately, despite the fact that many, including us, have already said when we were in the beginnings of the COVID-19 crisis that we need more coordination on these things, we haven't come very far, at least in terms of the actual challenge and what we are presenting at the European level. So it is probably coordinated chaos, but not enough coordination.
Makes one wonder a bit why he decided at the last minute to put it on the agenda at all. But Fabian, Brexit underlined at the post-summit press conference, this was an information point only, it was said rather sternly. We were not discussing it. We will come back to this in 2 weeks' time. But there have also been negotiations going on this week as we came on air for our weekly update. We haven't heard from Michel Barnier or from David Frost, so I don't know whether we know much about what's going on behind the scenes. What I hear people saying all the time is, the moment you know there's progress is when it goes really quiet. And then people talk about this dreadful term about going into the tunnel. People say, oh, as the EU's always called it. No, this was invented very recently by the Brits, I think. I've never heard an EU official until Brexit talk about going into a tunnel. But an EU official said last night, it is not time for the tunnel yet. Maybe at the end of the month, you need 2 to tunnel. Where are we in a couple of minutes, if you would?
In a couple of minutes, it's very challenging because there is not much clarity where we are. But I also wouldn't read too much in the ups and downs of the negotiations. We have 2 parallel processes going on. One is the technical negotiation, where there's some good progress on certain areas. There are still some tricky areas which haven't been resolved. But there's also the political negotiation or the political exchange, because often this is also not happening in a face-to-face way. And there, I would just emphasize again the importance of the UK internal market bill. Sometimes I feel commentators are forgetting that this is in the background, but this is something which is not acceptable to the European Union. So there doesn't only have to be a U-turn of Boris Johnson on some of the issues, such as level playing field conditions. There also has to be a major U-turn on the UK internal market bill. And so far, there is no indication from the UK that they're willing to do that. Now, we now have a meeting between von der Leyen and Boris Johnson. There are some people who feel that this could be the breakthrough. I'm rather skeptic about that because firstly, I don't think this is the moment yet when Boris Johnson would U-turn. It is too early for him. He has no need to U-turn at this point. I think also it is not in the nature of this government to deal with the European institutions. I think there will be a need to have national leaders involved, and preferably for Boris Johnson, it has to be Angela Merkel. And I think also we are not at the point yet where some of these issues have been resolved. And if the EU would actually agree something with the UK, with the UK internal market bill still hanging over us, I think also that is a very dangerous development for the European Union.
Parliament has made it clear they would veto it, so
yes, but also it would look like we are actually open to blackmail. Even if the UK then withdraws it, it would mean that we have given a country which has told us that they are breaking the treaties we have with them, and we reward them with another treaty.
Okay. Last question. I started with a quote from Charles Michel from his invitation letter to the heads of state and government, talking about, we're here to talk about our capacity to shape our destiny. For you, Janis, is our destiny as a European Union any clearer as a result of the last 48 hours? Have they shed any light on any of it for you? And what will we be talking about when we have our next update after the next summit in 2 weeks' time? What is on the agenda for the next one? And might that help us to get clearer about our destiny? Question to you both, a couple of minutes each, and then we must close.
Well, I think that nobody actually expected that after the summit, our destiny would be clearer, and it is not clear, and nobody should have expected. I know. But again, I think it was important to have the summit. We should not underestimate the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean. If the situation there would enormously escalate, we would have a lot of problems, not only in the regions, but overall with respect to the EU. We're talking about geopolitical, political, economic, migration-related problems. So it was worth to have the summit. Again, the problem is obviously not solved, but at least the different fractions among the EU 27 have found a common base for the time being. So that was very important. And as we discussed, it opened the way with respect to Belarus. So if we wouldn't have had the summit, who knows what would have happened and how that would have affected our destiny. Now, with respect to what we will come back when we have our update after the regular October summit, it will be EU-UK negotiations, and maybe this will be the topic, and maybe also lead to a long night discussion. We will discuss climate, where they will have an orientation debate among heads of state and government. External relations, especially with Africa, will be on the agenda. And then, last but not least, MFF, Next Generation EU, recovery, and that all means rule of law, and that is a very thorny issue. So it could be a tough ride in October.
Thank you very much. Fabian, do you think our destiny is becoming any clearer as a result of all this?
Destiny for me sounds a bit like a destination, that we actually know where we are trying to go. And if you want to shape your destiny, you need to have a pretty good idea of what you want it to be. And at the moment, we don't know that because there are also big differences between the way different member states see the European Union, different member states see different policy issues. I think we have a bit more clarity in the sense that there are some big themes which the member states are signing up to. I think it was also important that some of this was also an endorsement of the State of the Union speech. Some of the issues which were mentioned there were picked up and were reinforced. So in that sense, I think we know a little bit more in what direction the journey is going, but certainly we're not at a destination yet.
And we will continue this conversation in 2 weeks' time when we bring you our next post-summit briefing regular update. Thank you very much to both of you. Thank you in absentia again to Amanda. Thank you to all of you for joining. Just to point out a couple of things, watch out for a publication published today on the Conference of the Future of Europe. Is the EU still serious about the Balkans and if the events I mentioned earlier. There are a number of events next week, but one I really wanted to underline, draw your attention to, given our conversation today, next Tuesday on the rule of law with the European Commissioner for Justice, Didier Reynders. And as we've said, I will be back with Fabian and Janis in a couple of weeks' time to analyse the next conference and whether we are any clearer on where we are going. Thank you all very much. Have a very good weekend and stay safe. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.